Well, Brad, thanks for joining us.
Glad to be here.
Why don't we start with you introducing yourself and sort of, the arc of your career and how you came to be where you are now.
Well, thanks, Matt. I'm Brad Fitch. I'm president and CEO of the Congressional Management Foundation. I've been CEO and president for 10 years, although it's my second tour of duty here. I was deputy director from '01 to '05. I got here the same way a lot of people got here. Started with a high school trip here to Washington, D.C. from a small town in upstate New York, and kind of got Potomac fever and realized this is where I wanted to make my life. And I started out as a TV reporter, working for small stations throughout the South and the Southwest, and made my way to Capitol Hill and worked on the Hill for 13 years as a press secretary, legislative director, chief of staff in the House and Senate. And then found the Congressional Management Foundation, which has really just changed my life in a lot of ways. And it taught me a lot about processes and how Congress works and how to make it better. Along the way, I started an internet startup, which was a fun thing to do, and wrote a couple of books on communications and advocacy. But now my life's work is working here at CMF as we try to do two things: improve the operations of the institution of Congress, build more trust and effectiveness in members and their staffs and the institution. But we also help on the citizen side in training citizen advocates. We're the leading trainer of citizen advocates in the US, helping them have a better understanding and communications with Congress. Over 90,000 Americans have participated in one of our programs in just the last 7 years alone. And our goal is if we have a better citizenry, if we have a better Congress, maybe we'll have a better democracy.
Fantastic. So can you talk a little bit about, I guess on a broad strokes, what are your main sort of areas of focus or research, generally speaking? You mentioned sort of what the foundation is doing, but overall, are there major strands of your work?
Yeah, I'd have to say definitely a major strand of our work in the last decade has been citizen engagement. We've obviously gone through a significant transformation with how Congress and citizens interact as a result of the internet. Early on in 2000, 2002, 2004, it was very awkward. Congress, for example, didn't really know how to build websites that constituents wanted to use. And one of the programs that the Congressional Management Foundation created, which really redefined the modern website on Capitol Hill, is called the Gold Mouse program, where we gave out awards for congressional offices for the best websites. Congress, they're competitive beasts. And you'd be shocked at how competitive they were going after a little hunk of plastic that said Gold Mouse on it. And so we helped them build better websites that were more transparent, that were less like billboards and more like libraries, which was really a big strain and transformation. And even for me as a communicator, I came out of the public relations school, and you wrote press releases like your boss walked on water, and yet we learned that actually you gain more credibility if you're a politician if you create more nonpartisan websites, more informational websites. So a big part of what CMF has been doing in the last 20 years is trying to improve citizen engagement, especially from the congressional perspective. And I think as we move towards the future and we see the effect of remote work and how coronavirus has changed operations, I think Congress is going to begin down this road that they've already, or continue down this road they've already begun, which is having more online and telephone town hall meetings, less emphasis on interacting with citizens through direct mail and through associations and nonprofits. It doesn't mean that associations and nonprofits don't play an incredibly important role in facilitating democracy. They do, and they will continue to. But I think Congress is also learning ways to build forums and opportunities to interact with citizens, their constituents, in frankly more robust and meaningful ways. And I think that's where I see the future of citizen engagement going in a very positive way from where we are in the last, say, 10 years.
So it sounds like the Congressional Management Foundation is really focused on this one aspect of congressional representation, which is engaging with its constituency. Is that right? Versus the legislative or oversight responsibilities?
That's exactly right. I like to say we focus on the retail level of democracy, where citizens and Congress come together. That doesn't mean we don't work with individual offices to make them more effective legislatively. We do, but most of our effort is around the operational aspect, and especially the operational aspect of how they interact with citizens in a way that will genuinely build trust between that citizen and the member of Congress, but also the Congress writ large. And that's a really important thing to do right now, because there has been a significant breakdown in trust in our society, in institutions. We all know that. We all see the same survey data. And so are there ways, and we're exploring this, are there ways of members of Congress, through their behavior, through their actions, to enhance citizens, both their trust, but also their user experience as well, of interacting with a congressional office, almost like a business. And we do encourage, by the way, congressional offices do customer service surveys. Survey your constituency. How are you doing? Have you done a little better? Could you work better? And not the surveys that I used to write when I was a press secretary, which would be like, my question would be, does my boss walk on regular water or fizzy water, would be kind of the question I would ask. Not a real question, but real honest to goodness. How do we do? What can we do better? What would make you want to come back for more information? Take almost a page out of the business community, customer service community, and put it into the political community.
So maybe we can take the different modes of connection between, between Congress and the constituency, and talk a little bit about your work, how it modifies each of those areas. So you mentioned the internet, obviously, and then there's the face-to-face element. There's group elements like town halls. Would you mind just walking us through kind of each of the ways that they communicate, and how the Congressional Management Foundation gets involved in that, or helps the representative kind of strategize around that modality?
Okay, well, let's start with, unfortunately, the dominant form of democratic dialogue, and I'm using that term very loosely here in America, is a direct mail campaign that's facilitated by an association or nonprofit or company that goes into Capitol Hill, and then Congress responds. Over 50 million messages are sent annually to Congress this way. What we try to help Congress do is something as basic as doing a better job in writing back. Someone asked me years ago, what's the biggest obstacle to improving the democratic dialogue in America? And my reply was bad writing. And it happens on both the association nonprofit side, who are lobbyists often drafting these things, and it happens on the congressional side. Well, we can help the congressional side a lot. And our message to Congress is, your job is not to respond to the constituent, it's to listen and connect. And that's a little bit different. So you want to build a connection with that constituent, so perhaps they'll continue, frankly, engaging with you in a way. I think a lot of congressional staff just want the letter off their desk, and so they can do other things. And I get that. And I worked on Capitol Hill 13 years, and that's kind of my attitude. But in today's day and age, with so many opportunities and so many citizens interacting with Congress, they've got to do a better job connecting with constituents through these associations and nonprofits that are giving them a robust opportunity. So now let's take a look at some of the other ways that they interact with constituents. In the one-on-one is obviously an area where Congress doesn't need a lot of training. When they get a group of constituents that are coming for a fly-in or lobby day or meeting with in their district, they're actually quite good at what they do. They're politicians, and their job is to make you feel good. And this is the NFL of legislatures, and they're usually very good at that. Where they do need some help, especially in the communications area, is these new and emerging technologies, especially online and telephone town hall meetings. We've done extensive research on these. And first of all, let me just break up this myth that members of Congress are using these to avoid constituents. That is absolutely untrue. They take any and all calls. They actually like to get a hostile call on their telephone town hall meetings to demonstrate, hey, look, I'm listening to everybody. And they need help there. I think this is where some just basic communications training is an area where we're going to try to help them, listen more and get to more calls, perhaps batch the calls in topic areas. Our research shows that citizens like it on a focused topic, as opposed to, talking about coronavirus on one question and then going on to potholes on Main Street. It's much better to stay focused. And in fact, the members that have had online and telephone town hall meetings in the last year on coronavirus have found citizens participating immensely satisfied. One of the research areas we explored was a pilot program on bipartisan online town halls and telephone town halls. Now, why would you want to do bipartisan? Well, for a few reasons. One, our research shows it's really hard to get people from the other party to join your call. Democratic members of Congress and Republican members of Congress have trouble getting people from the other party. You have to try 4 or 5 times. So unfortunately, many of these calls end up being echo chambers where they're just listening to their supporters. Secondly, when it comes to coronavirus and COVID-19, research shows in general that citizens are more likely to listen to a bipartisan message. It's unfortunate that this has become partisan. A public health crisis should not be a red or blue problem, but it has. But if you've got a Democrat and Republican and a public health official talking about this, you're going to have much more credibility. So I think in those areas, those forums, those probably are one of the most exciting new forums available, especially when you move it to, frankly, in a computer format or a tablet format where people are getting a much more robust experience. Citizens are more likely to stay, they're more likely to ask a question, they're more likely to share that information with their friends and their neighbors and their family. So that, I think, is a very big, robust area. So those two areas of just literally the constituent email reply and the online telephone town hall meetings are big areas. The other area that Congress has control of, and we could help them and see an area for potential improvement, is the e-newsletters. And email is still the dominant form of communications. I know people talk about social media, but you still have vastly more people, 5, 6, 7, 10 times more people who have with an email account compared to a Facebook account or a Twitter account. So that's an important medium we have to pay attention to. A few years ago, we gave an award to a member of Congress for transparency and accountability. We call it the Democracy Award, largely because of their email program, which was incredibly robust, very nonpartisan. They'd send out information. They'd link to other government sites with information on the topic. If someone wrote in talking about the environment, maybe they linked them to the EPA or some other independent research. Citizens, we know, like that kind of information. I was interviewing someone who, in this particular case, was praising the email newsletter of her Secretary of State. He said, "Oh, I love the e-newsletter of my Secretary of State." I'm like, wait, I've never heard anybody say they love a politician's e-newsletter. This was a nurse I was talking to. And she just rattled off why she liked it. It touched on points that were of interest to her. It showed transparency about what was going on in government. It had lots of links so that she could explore further information. Congress, again, needs to talk more like a librarian and less like a politician in these e-newsletters. So I think that's another area that, again, is reaching millions and millions of people. Congress can do a better job, and the Congressional Management Foundation is trying to help them do that better job.
So can you talk a little bit about each of these kinds of ways of reaching constituents? How many are they really reaching, or other statistics about that? So you talk about town halls. In a typical congressional district, what percentage of people actually would attend a town hall, or how many would actually read an email or send a letter? I would have to imagine it would be a tiny minority in each of those cases, but maybe I'm way off. Or is it different between districts and Senate?
It is different in some districts. It's not a tiny minority, but it's by not quite a majority. It might be a majority of voters, because if you look at, although this election kind of throws those numbers off, but it might be a majority of voters. So if you're looking at the number of people that send an email to a member of Congress, the average is going to be around 50 or 60,000 constituents. And when you're looking at a district of 700,000 and you think that 300,000 are voters, okay, that's going to be about right there, just 25% of all voters are going to be emailing members of Congress. And the research shows that if you email your member of Congress, you're more likely to vote, you're more likely to participate in an association or nonprofit, you're more likely to participate in a public meeting. So you're a poly-influential is what the researchers call. Then you go to the online telephone town hall meetings, and this year's numbers, because of coronavirus, warped everything in the past. So we don't have good numbers, but in the past, the average number of constituents in a online or telephone town hall meeting for a House member was between 3,000 and 7,000 people. Now, multiply that 10 or 20 times. And again, now you're getting 50, 60, 70,000 people. So you are starting to get some scalability that gets up there. Again, not quite hitting a majority, but not a tiny fraction. I think one of the other mistakes that people make is they do think that they're getting nothing but partisans through a lot of these interactions. Most of the interactions that Congress has is not about the big issues of the day or what I call electoral or representational issues. So if you look at those issues that are going to really affect the member's reputation or affect an electoral outcome, it really comes down to guns, immigration, abortion, and sometimes healthcare. Not all the time healthcare, and sometimes terrorism, but not all the time terrorism, if you look at the last 20 years. most of the content that members of Congress are interacting with citizens on is whether or not to increase funding for Alzheimer's research, or whether or not horses should be transported on double-decker trucks, because PETA doesn't want horses transported on double-decker trucks, or truck drivers who want to transport the horses on double-decker trucks. So it's these more niche issues. Some people call them special interests. I call them truck drivers, animal rights activists, and people with Alzheimer's. I mean, it's really much more of a mixture of Americans. And 90 to 95% of the interactions that members have when they interact with citizens is about an issue that is very, very important to that individual person or group of people, but may not be interesting or important to 95% of the rest of the constituency. So that's what they're dealing with mostly. So you may be dealing with a very small group of people in terms of the constituency, although, Alzheimer's, 2 in 5 people are going to be affected by Alzheimer's sometime in our lifetime. So that's a pretty big number, but not all people are going to be affected by, double-decker trucks. So it really does expand and contract depending upon the issue. But for those people, it's really important. It's sometimes a life or death issue when you're talking about patient advocacy or some of the medical professions. It's very important to those folks, and those that can frankly communicate that effectively make a huge difference.
Yeah, so that's interesting that, in something that I think is always on people's minds is that the most intense interactions that the rep has is with a set of narrow interest groups inside their own constituency rather than kind of a median kind of voter, if you will. So I'm wondering, if you're really interacting, or if the rep is really interacting with, say, 50,000 of its constituency, how are they collecting, and since you're in this whole area of trying to make this connection, how are they get the information from the rest of the district, right? Whether it's their own party, whether it's a different party, whether they're voters, whether they're non-voters, what are the ways that they're trying to assess that, or do they not bother because they're not going to vote?
Well, Matt, I think you've hit on a very important gap in our democracy, to be very frank, that I think there are, whether it's underserved communities or people that are not connecting to Congress, it's not as much voters, it's those people that choose to participate. As Thomas Jefferson said, in our democracy, we do not have a government by the majority, we have a government by the majority who participate. And I do believe that there is sizable parts of our society that have checked out of the democratic system, whether by not voting, not interacting with members, and they think their voice doesn't count. Regrettably, our research shows their voice does count if they do get engaged on an issue that's important to them, and the Congress will listen to them. I mean, Congress, they're the best pollsters in the world because they're the only pollsters who, if they get the answer wrong, they lose their job. So they have a big incentive to get this right. Now, having said that, most members of Congress, and I've done some focus groups with members on this, most members would say that staying in touch with constituents is their top priority and that they do a very good job of it. Well, I'm not sure they do a good job of the mosaic of the district, and that's one of the things we're trying to fix at CMF, and seeing ways that we can build connections and build bridges between those parts and those constituencies you just identified that probably aren't being heard with their elected officials. And we've got a couple interesting experiments on the drawing board right now that will try to do that using online and telephone town hall meetings and trusted third parties. And so I think that there is a challenge in our democracy, and I would have to generally agree with the thrust of your question that how do they do it? And my answer would be, how do they connect with these people that are not being heard? And my answer, unfortunately, would be poorly right now. I don't think there is a real strong interest. Ironically, though, when you actually talk to members of Congress, they'd love to connect with these people. I know that sounds weird, right? So wait, you'd want to talk with somebody who didn't share your values or who frankly might think you're, evil. And the reason they want to is every politician thinks if they get 15 minutes with a voter, they can turn them around. I mean, that's their ego talking there. And I remember talking about this experiment I just shared with you, the idea of putting together a member of Congress with a constituency that just doesn't like him or her. And I talked to a chief of staff about this, and she said, well, I hate the idea, my boss would love it. And it's exactly for those reasons. Most politicians think that if they get some time with the opposition, that they can have a decent conversation with them. And that's the other myth. People think that Congress doesn't want to listen. Congress loves to listen. There's a couple of very interesting projects that are underway. One is done by a group called Voice of the People, which is out of the University of Maryland. And what they're doing at Voice of the People is they're creating what they call kind of citizen cabinets. And they're putting together long format events where citizens in Rochester, New York, or Bethesda, Maryland, will wrestle with an issue. Sometimes the issues are very difficult, like Social Security reform. Sometimes they're difficult, but they're not weighty, like postal reform was one of the issues they wrestled with. And a member of Congress was offered the opportunity to come in and spend 2 hours in these sessions. And the members were like, wait a minute, I get to spend 2 hours with informed voters talking about policy stuff. That's why I ran for office. So they love these opportunities. They're all policy wonks. They'd much rather be doing that than raising money. And so I think there's some really interesting work being done, not just by Voice of the People and the Congressional Management Foundation, but some other groups out there as well. Ohio State has a new institute that we work with, the Institute for Democratic Engagement and Accountability, run by Dr. Marco Neblo. We've done some very interesting work with them. So I think that, you know, the positive side of trying to engage constituencies who are not often heard is that there is work being done, some novel and innovative breakthrough work that is being done out there that shows real promise.
And so what about other ways to collect information from the non-typicals? You know, are there other ways that they collect data, whether it's statistically, whether it's through, you know, surveys or polling or whatever, you know, some new technology where they can somehow infer what those groups are interested in or care about, or their positions on particular issues? Is there any movement in that area?
Well, you and I are recording this about a week after the election, and I don't think anyone is going to say polling is a really good idea on trying to figure out what's going on in America right now. But we'll see what the postmortem is for that. You know, members of Congress are complicated beings when it comes to interpreting constituent opinion. They look at the mosaic of information that's presented to them. And I really mean a mosaic because it can come in a variety of forms. It can be in the form of the constituent mail, where they might get a report that the number one issue this month is the Paycheck Protection Program or unemployment insurance. It can be in in-person meetings. Personal stories go a long way in influencing members of Congress. Just hearing a data point on the effect of a bill or a vote can have a profound impact on a member of Congress. I was told this one story by a medical professional. It was right after the Affordable Care Act was passed. And she talked about how she had a meeting with a member of Congress and before the vote. And there was this amendment that was coming up. And she talked to the member this way. She said, Congressman, if you vote for this amendment, your constituents are going to have to drive farther and pay more money to get the same procedure they're getting today. And the member turned to his staffer and said, we're done. What's next? That's all it took was one person's story. And I've got quite a few anecdotes where it's just one individual story can make a difference. It can be chance meetings. I knew a United States senator that when she did her shopping, she liked to go shopping for a number of reasons, because she felt that was one of the most casual ways she could interact with constituents in a meaningful, almost non-threatening way. I mean, when you're in the fast food department or in the frozen food department, you know, it's hard to get somebody mad and you can't throw anything at them. And she did tell me this one funny part of it. So when she goes shopping, she always hits frozen foods last because she knows everything's going to melt by the time she gets there, because she'll spend an hour and a half to 2 hours, you know, at the Safeway. So it might be something as casual as that. But so it is this mosaic of information. Certainly going into elections, every member of Congress was using polling. But that again is, you know, going to be looking at likely voters, which is a subset, maybe 50 to 75% of their constituency. And again, for some of these people in some of these constituencies, they're not going to have a lot of interaction. I sadly asked a legislative director, a friend of mine a few years ago, who is a legislative director for a progressive Democrat. I said, when was the last time your boss had lunch with a Republican? He couldn't identify it, you know, a time. And that obviously is a significant change than 30 years ago. So I think they do get this mosaic of information, but it's still an incomplete mosaic. It's still a puzzle that hasn't been completely filled out.
And I would imagine it's worse for the Senate in that case, since they have a bigger constituency, or is it easier for them to think more statistically rather than relationship based?
It's actually easier for the Senate. Most senators will view their role and their responsibility as being senator for the entire state. And so they make it more of an effort. They also, frankly, have more resources. Think of poor North Dakota, and the House member for North Dakota has 16 people. The senator has 38. So the senator can have a robust relationship. Obviously, a senator from California can't quite do that, and it is state by state specific. The North Dakota senators are going to have much more of an opportunity to have a closer relationship and a broader, more robust understanding of their entire state. But yeah, senators actually do try to cover the waterfront and get as many different constituencies connected as possible in their world, and they usually do a pretty good job of it. When you look at it, the totality of their work over time. House members, on the other hand, again, it's really who comes knocking on the door. It's that majority who participate that really get heard. And again, it is a skewed demographic. I'll just give you, this is a weird statistic I'll give you, but as I told you, the Congressional Management Foundation does more training of citizen advocates than any other group in America. We've done over 500 training sessions in person. We've done about 300 in the last 5 years. I've personally done about 150. And that means I go to a hotel in Washington, there's a group of patient advocates there, whether it's MS, or there's a group of business people there, like National Federation of Independent Businesses, NFIB. I can tell you that in Washington, D.C., the vast majority of people who are talking to Congress are white, older males, unless it's an unusual demographic like the Dietitian Society, which is middle-aged females who are really in great shape because they eat really well. So it's really, again, I'm sorry to make demographic statistics, but I'm looking at the audience and it's like, it's the healthiest audience I've ever seen. Of course, they're dietitians. And so it really, but the vast majority, unfortunately, is the people that can afford to fly to Washington and meet with their member of Congress. Now, back home, hopefully the member's doing a better job of outreach and is interacting with more people, and hopefully they're trying to connect with those constituencies that may not feel their voices being heard. But that's something we're going to need to research and look at, because in general, when you look at who attends these online and telephone town hall meetings, it's more of an echo chamber than it is a diverse representation of the district.
So let's take a little bit more detail on the area you mentioned on staffing, and what kind of staff is dedicated to these different types of constituent activities versus legislation or oversight, or communications. I think that's an area people have very little knowledge about, and you have a lot of direct experience working with offices. How are the House staffs and the Senate staffs organized to serve constituents? If they have, X number of staffers, how many are engaged in constituent service, and how are they allocating their time?
Well, let's just take a typical House office, which has about, on average, 16 people working there. So as you rightly defined it, Matt, they fall into two categories: what we'll call the legislative responsibilities of the office and the representational responsibilities of the office. And actually, the representational areas have been increasing only because members of Congress have needed to increase their communication staff, and the communication staff increasingly are focusing on the social media components, the online and telephone town hall meeting components. So when I was a press secretary, my job in the late 80s and 90s was as a broadcaster. It wasn't interactive. Where increasingly the public relations staff of a congressional office is dealing with the public a lot more than they did. And that's, equally important. I mean, culling that Twitter feed, taking a look at that Facebook page, creating Facebook town halls, which increasingly members are doing, is the communication staff responsibility. The district staff is the real team that is the on the ground, real retail level democracy, where they are doing two basic functions. One, they're doing outreach, hopefully in a thoughtful way. They're looking at the district both geographically and demographically and say, who does the member and I need to talk to? And it can be broken down by something as simple as, I want to connect to all the Rotary clubs. I know a member of Congress, African-American member of the South, and one of the metrics he used was how many connections he had to barbershops in his district, because in his district, that's where the African-American community often would congregate and socialize. So he literally had a metric of how many barbershops. So hopefully they're doing it in some sort of thoughtful way that's going to find the people they want to talk to. Then the second area compared to outreach is what is called casework, where the member of Congress serves as an ombudsman. Now, most people prior to this year didn't quite know that role. But when the Paycheck Protection Program was rolled out and there were so many significant problems with it, everybody contacted the member of Congress for help. And by the way, the Small Business Administration, which oversaw that program, deserves a little bit of leeway. They never had anything that large and they never did anything that fast. So on some levels, I can appreciate how difficult it must have been for the executive branch to do that. But it didn't roll out perfectly. We're in the middle of a pandemic. People are losing their jobs, they're losing their businesses, and the federal government's waving $1 trillion out in front of us. I was one of them, by the way, who was at the teller window signing a document needing support to support my nonprofit. So that casework responsibility, that ombudsman role, that customer service role became an incredible part of the congressional responsibilities in 2020, and one that most Americans didn't realize that Congress did. And it's a very important part. Granted, you're not going to be connecting to 70,000 people. You'll be lucky if you do 7,000 cases of a House office in a year. And politically, you don't get a lot out of it, right? It's not like you're doing a big media story because you helped the dry cleaner keep his business running because people weren't getting their clothes dry cleaned because they weren't going to work. But for that dry cleaner, you change that person's life. And that's kind of this part of the story of Congress that most Americans never see. And yet for most members, and certainly for their staff that are doing that kind of work, it's the most rewarding part of it. It's a very difficult, emotionally wrenching job to be a field representative or caseworker. It's just very difficult because you're dealing with some really difficult stories, sometimes life and death stories that you're having to manage. And they do, the caseworkers we do deal with, they're just angels. And most of them are women, by the way. That's the demographic. It's like about 65% of that staff are women. They're older. They're more likely to have children as opposed to the legislative staff, which is more likely to be single, younger. The average age of a House legislative assistant is 27 years old. So it is a different role for that. But again, we talked about the constituent engagement in 2020 at the height of the pandemic this spring, when the Paycheck Protection Program and unemployment insurance and healthcare concerns, Congress had to transform itself into a customer service operation. We know one office that, because they're all remote at that point, they completely destroyed their org chart, and they did all 16 people into 4 departments, and the departments were organized by constituent need. So a caseworker became a department head of unemployment insurance or Paycheck Protection Program, and then was assigned 2 or 3 staffers. And it might have been the digital director, the staff assistant in DC, didn't matter. But it meant that if you phoned that congressional office and you had a problem, that office had 3 people deep to give you first call resolution to get an answer when you called. So we talked a little bit about how you asked about how they're organized. I'll let you know next year because this has been a transformative year. And I think our research shows that more members of Congress are looking to reorganize to be more customer service oriented. As we all know, we're going to be dealing with the pandemic through 21. We are looking at more support coming to citizens and businesses, possibly in the form of another rescue package from the Congress. So their customer service job and constituent engagement job in that area is probably not going away for a while, and probably is going to have some permanent changes on how they look at their job and their experience.
So historically, how many people, what percentage of the staff has been focused more on this constituent service from the House and Senate?
Historically, the average breaks down. It's not quite 50-50, it's 60-40. Usually about 60% of the staff is in Washington, 40% in DC. But even that 60% in Washington, they're spending a sizable amount of their time on citizen engagement and constituent engagement, whether it's through managing social media and interacting that way, or just responding to the tens of thousands of messages that are being sent by constituents.